I've been trucking for close to 15 years now, and while I've had my share of strange experiences, nothing compares to what happened to me in the fall of 2019. I was hauling a load of furniture from Houston to a small town just outside of Shreveport, Louisiana. The drive was mostly uneventful, but things took a turn around midnight when I found myself deep in the piney woods of East Texas. It was a clear night with a faint breeze rustling through the trees, but the road ahead was dark, pitch black, except for what my headlights could manage. I was driving on an old highway that barely saw any traffic, especially at that time of night. It was one of those stretches where you don't see a single gas station or rest stop for miles. The isolation didn't bother me much. After years on the road, you get used to it. But there was something about that night that felt off. Maybe it was just the eerie silence, or maybe it was because I'd been driving for too long, but I had this nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. About 30 miles outside of the nearest town, I saw a flicker of light ahead. It wasn't headlights, more like a small, contained fire. As I got closer, I realized it was an old pickup truck pulled over to the side of the road. The hood was popped open, and there was smoke coming out of the engine. A lone figure stood next to it, waving one arm, trying to flag me down. Now, I'm not one to leave stranded on the side of the road, especially not in the middle of nowhere, so I slowed down and pulled over a few yards in front of the truck. The guy walked up to my cab as I rolled down the window. He was tall and thin, probably in his early 50s, with a scraggly beard and a worn-out baseball cap. His clothes looked like they hadn't seen a washing machine in months, and his face was smudged with dirt. Still, he didn't seem dangerous, just a guy in a bad situation. "Thanks for stopping," he said, his voice hoarse. "Damn thing just died on me. Couldn't get it to start again. Think you could give me a hand?" I hesitated for a second, but he didn't seem threatening. Besides, I had a toolbox in the truck, and I figured I could at least take a look at his engine. I parked my semi properly off the road and grabbed a flashlight before stepping out into the cool night air. As I walked over to the pickup, the man stood by, watching me closely. The engine didn't look too bad, just overheated, most likely. I figured it might need some coolant, or he just needed to let it sit for a bit before trying again. I told him as much, but he didn't seem interested in my assessment. "That ain't the real problem," he muttered, glancing nervously toward the tree line on the other side of the road. I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away, just kept staring into the darkness. Finally, he turned back to me, his expression hard to read in the dim light. "Something followed me out here," he said quietly. "It's been watching me for the past hour. I thought he was messing with me, or maybe he'd been out in the woods too long and was getting jumpy, but there was a seriousness in his tone that made my skin crawl. "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He pointed toward the woods, just beyond the edge of my headlights. "I don't know what it is. It's big, though. I saw it moving through the trees. Thought it was a deer at first, but it's not. It's something else." I glanced in the direction he was pointing, but all I saw was darkness. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, but there was no sign of movement. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. "Maybe it's just an animal," I said, though even I didn't fully believe it. "A bear, maybe?" He shook his head. "No, it ain't a bear. It's too quiet, too smart. I can feel it watching us." I didn't know what to say to that. I was about to suggest we get back in our vehicles when I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the woods. It was faint, barely audible over the wind, but it was there. The man froze, his eyes wide with fear. "That's it," he whispered. "That's what I've been hearing." I felt my heart rate pick up, and I instinctively took a step back toward my truck. "Maybe we should get out of here," I suggested, trying to sound calm. He nodded quickly, but before either of us could move, we heard a rustling sound, a branch snapping in the distance. The growling grew louder, closer. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows across the road. I didn't wait to find out what was making that sound. "Get in your truck," I shouted, already backing toward my semi. "Now!" The man scrambled toward his pickup as I jumped into my cab and slammed the door shut. My hands were shaking as I fumbled to start the engine. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but I couldn't see anything behind me except darkness. I pulled out onto the highway as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. In my side mirror, I saw the man's pickup still sitting there, smoke billowing from the engine. He hadn't managed to get it started, and I knew he wouldn't be able to outrun whatever was in those woods. I drove for what felt like an eternity, my eyes glued to the road ahead. Eventually, I made it to the next town, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, lurking in the shadows.
Story number 2.
I was making a run from Nashville, Tennessee, to Salt Lake City, Utah, just over 1,500 miles. I had been on the road for about a year at this point, so I wasn't green, but I wasn't a seasoned vet either. My boss had given me a shipment that needed to be delivered within a tight window, so I knew I was in for a grueling drive. I had already gotten used to the isolation, though. Hell, I kind of enjoyed it sometimes. You get lost in your own world out there on the open road, with nothing but your thoughts, the hum of the engine, and the endless blacktop. It was a little after midnight when things started to get weird. I was somewhere in the middle of Kansas. You know that part where the fields stretch for miles, and it feels like you're driving through a never-ending corn maze? It was one of those nights where the highway seemed to stretch out infinitely in front of me, the kind where you start questioning whether you're even moving at all. I was starting to feel that creeping tiredness, the kind that sneaks up on you, where you catch yourself blinking just a little too long. I figured it was time to stop before I ended up in a ditch. I saw a sign for a truck stop a few miles ahead and made the decision to pull over. The place looked standard enough. A few pumps, a convenience store, and a diner with flickering neon lights advertising open 24 hours. As I pulled in, I noticed something strange. The parking lot was completely empty. It was a bit unusual, considering this was the only stop for miles. But I chalked it up to the time of night and figured most drivers were probably parked somewhere for the night, sleeping. After parking my rig, I headed inside the convenience store to grab a coffee and maybe a snack to keep me awake. The door made this loud, creaking sound as I pushed it open, which startled me a bit, but I laughed it off. The inside was dimly lit, and there was no one at the counter. I called out, "Anyone here?" but got no response. The place looked like it hadn't seen a customer in years. Shelves were dusty, and the air was stale, but I was too tired to care. I just needed coffee. I found an old, grimy-looking coffee machine in the corner and started brewing a cup. As I waited, I heard a soft rustling sound behind me. My heart skipped a beat. I turned around but didn't see anything. It was just the aisles of old snacks and drinks. I brushed it off. Probably a rat or something. I grabbed my coffee, paid by leaving some cash on the counter, and walked back to my truck. As I climbed into the cab, I felt a chill run down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I looked around the lot, still completely empty. Just me, my truck, and the eerie glow of the gas station lights. I shook my head, telling myself I was just tired, and hopped back into the driver's seat. The first hour of driving was uneventful. The caffeine was starting to kick in, and I was zoning out, focusing on the road ahead. That's when I saw it in the distance. Another set of headlights in my rearview mirror. The road had been empty for miles, and suddenly this car seemed to appear out of nowhere. It was a beat-up old sedan, and it was gaining on me fast. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just some guy in a rush. But as the car got closer, I started to get an uneasy feeling. It wasn't just speeding, it was tailing me. Really riding my bumper. I tapped the brakes a little, hoping they'd get the hint and back off, but they didn't. Instead, the car swerved into the other lane, trying to pass me. I could feel my pulse quicken as I watched the sedan pull up next to me, matching my speed. That's when I saw them. There were 3 people inside, all staring at me with blank, expressionless faces. Their eyes didn't move, they just kept staring. I looked ahead, trying to ignore them, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Then, without warning, the car veered into my lane, nearly sideswiping my truck. I slammed on the brakes and the car shot ahead, disappearing into the darkness. I thought it was over, just some weirdos messing around. But about 20 minutes later, I saw the headlights again. They had pulled over to the side of the road, hazard lights blinking, as if they were waiting for me. My heart was racing now, but I couldn't stop. There was nowhere to go, just miles of empty highway. As I approached the car, I noticed the 3 figures standing outside, lined up along the road, still staring. Their faces were pale, almost sickly, and their clothes looked tattered, like they had been out there for days. As I drove past, I made the mistake of looking in my rearview mirror. They were gone. The car was still there, but the people had vanished. I checked my side mirrors, nothing. I couldn't explain it. I drove faster, trying to shake the feeling that they were still watching me.
Story number 3.
This happened when my friend Sarah and I were driving from Phoenix to Denver. It was a long trip, and we were pushing through as much of it as possible without stopping for too long. We had been on the road for hours, making our way through the empty stretches of highway. At this point, we were mostly stopping just to get gas or hit a restroom, trying to make good time. By the time we stopped at this particular rest area, it was around 2:30 or 3 in the morning, and we were both exhausted. We pulled into this deserted rest stop in the middle of New Mexico, somewhere off I-25. It was one of those small, isolated places where there wasn't much more than a couple of vending machines, a restroom building, and a couple of picnic tables. Only 1 or 2 other cars were there, both parked on the far end of the lot. I hopped out of the driver's seat and told Sarah I was going to stretch my legs and use the restroom before we switched off. She decided to stay in the car and rest for a bit, watching our stuff. The walk to the restroom was about 50 yards away from where we parked, and while the area was dimly lit, it felt secluded. I've never been one to get too worked up over eerie places, but this rest stop had a vibe to it. The air was cold, and the wind was whistling through the trees. It didn't help that there wasn't another soul in sight. After I finished in the restroom, I headed back toward the car when I noticed a beat-up old van that wasn't there before. It was parked a few spaces over from our car now, engine running, but the lights were off. I shrugged it off as some late-night traveler, but something felt off, especially since it wasn't there when I went into the restroom. As I got closer to the car, I saw the van's headlights flicker on for a second, then go off again. I paused. My first thought was that it was some sort of glitch or mistake. I continued walking, a bit faster this time, and the lights flickered on again, this time brighter and longer. I tried to shake the feeling that someone was watching me from inside that van. I reached into my pocket for my phone, glancing at the dark windows of the van. No movement, no sound. I quickened my pace, trying to keep calm. When I was only a few feet from the car, the van's headlights came on and stayed on this time, full beams blinding me. Annoyed, I reached out to open the car door, only to hear the unmistakable sound of a car door opening from the van. I froze. I turned slowly, squinting against the lights. I saw the silhouette of a man stepping out of the van, moving toward me. He was large, bulky, and had his hands in his pockets. Sarah, seeing my hesitation, sat up in the car and quickly hit the horn. The sound startled me, but it also made the man stop in his tracks. He stood there for a moment, as if sizing me up, before slowly stepping back toward his van. I didn't waste another second. I jumped into the car, and Sarah immediately locked the doors. The van's headlights turned off again, and for a few moments, we just sat there in silence, watching. The man didn't move. He stood by the van for what felt like forever, before finally getting back in and driving off, slowly. We didn't say a word. I just started the car and we took off, our hearts racing, not bothering to switch drivers like we had planned. Later, when we were calmer, Sarah told me that she saw the guy watching me from inside the van before he got out. We both agreed that it wasn't just coincidence, and the way he moved toward me was definitely unsettling. It was a close call, and I shudder to think what might have happened if Sarah hadn't been there or hadn't reacted so quickly.
Story number 4.
I've always been good at navigating open roads, but this particular trip had me on edge from the start. My name's Paul, and I was heading from Oklahoma to Nevada with a load of heavy equipment. This wasn't my first trip through the Southwest, and it wouldn't be my last. But what happened on this trip still sits with me, even years later. I'm not one for small talk or unnecessary details, so here's what went down. It was a standard job. Pick up in Oklahoma City, drop off just outside of Reno. I had a long stretch of nothing between towns, but that's par for the course in this line of work. The first day was smooth. I made good time, stopped for the night outside Amarillo, and had no issues. The next day, I cruised through New Mexico and crossed into Arizona by mid-afternoon. That's where things started to get strange. Arizona is beautiful in its own way, but it's also vast, empty, and can get downright eerie at times. The desert stretches out for miles, and you might not see another vehicle for hours. The sun was starting to set, casting a deep orange glow across the sky, and I figured it was about time to find a place to pull over for the night. I'd seen a sign for a rest stop about 20 miles up the road, so I decided that would be my spot. I pulled in just after sunset. The place was as deserted as the road had been for the last couple of hours. Not unusual, but there was something about this stop that felt different. Quieter, if that makes sense. I parked, killed the engine, and stepped out to stretch my legs. As I stood there, I noticed something out in the distance, maybe a quarter-mile off the road. It looked like an old, abandoned trailer, the kind you'd see on the outskirts of a ghost town. It wasn't close enough to be a concern, but it caught my eye. I shook it off, got back in the truck, and settled into my routine. After some food and a quick check on the load, I crawled into the back and settled in for the night. My cab was simple: bed, small fridge, some personal items. I had a couple of old DVDs and my portable player. That night, I threw on The Fast and the Furious, figuring it'd help me unwind after a long day. About an hour into the movie, just as I was dozing off, I heard something. At first, I thought it was part of the film, a faint tapping sound, but then I realized it was coming from outside. I paused the movie and listened closely. There it was again, a light, deliberate tapping on the side of my truck. Now, I've been doing this long enough to know that weird noises aren't uncommon, especially at night when your mind starts playing tricks on you. Still, this felt different. I sat up, turned off the DVD player, and listened. Nothing for a minute. Then, there it was. Tap, tap, tap. This time, closer to the door. I grabbed my flashlight from the overhead shelf and flicked it on. My heart wasn't racing, but I was definitely on alert. I opened the driver's side door and stepped down. The desert night was cool, and everything was dead silent. I walked around the truck, shining the light on the trailer and the ground below it. Nothing. No signs of anyone or anything. But the air felt thick, like something was off. Just as I turned to get back in, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I spun the light toward it. About 50 feet away, standing by the edge of the highway, was a figure. It was too far to make out any details, but it was definitely a person, just standing there, staring. I called out, "Hey, you need something?" No response. The figure didn't move. I stood there, frozen for what felt like minutes, but was probably only a few seconds. Then, without any warning, the figure turned and walked back into the desert, heading toward that old trailer I'd spotted earlier. I'm not superstitious, but every hair on my neck was standing up. I backed up to the truck, keeping my light trained on the spot where the figure had been. Once inside, I locked the doors and sat there, waiting. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound, every little creak from the truck made me jump. I never saw the figure again, and by morning, I was out of there before the sun fully broke the horizon. I made it to Reno with no other issues, but to this day, I can't shake the feeling that something was watching me that night in the desert. Maybe it was just a drifter. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. Whatever it was, I've avoided that stretch of highway ever since.
Story number 5.
I was 20 at the time, driving through the back roads of Louisiana on my way to visit my friend for the summer. I'd just finished my second year of college and was looking forward to some much-needed time off. My trip had been going smoothly for the first couple of hours. It was a quiet stretch of road, not much traffic, and I had my music blasting. Somewhere around a small town, I noticed an older SUV trailing me pretty closely. At first, I didn't think much of it. People get impatient and tailgate sometimes, especially on those back roads with not a lot of passing lanes. But after a few minutes, I realized this wasn't just impatience. Every time I sped up, he sped up. When I slowed down, he slowed down. That's when my heart started racing. I was still about 45 minutes from my destination, and there weren't any major towns coming up soon, just more rural stretches. I thought maybe he'd just pass me or turn off. but no, he stayed glued to my bumper, and I could see him waving in my rearview mirror. It was around 3 p.m., plenty of daylight, but the isolation of the road was getting to me. I thought maybe I should pull over at a gas station or store if I saw one. Sure enough, a few miles later, a small convenience store appeared, so I signaled and pulled in. The SUV followed me in, and that's when the dread hit hard. I got out of my car and did the casual checking my tires routine, even though there was nothing wrong with my car. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him step out of his SUV. He was in his late 40s, rough-looking, and had this strange grin on his face. My phone was in my hand, and I quickly unlocked it, just in case. "Hey there," he called out, walking toward me. "You from around here?" "No," I replied, keeping my voice steady, even though my nerves were shot. "Just passing through." "Well, you sure are pretty," he said, the grin never leaving his face. "Need any help with your car?" "No, I'm good," I said quickly, not even bothering with politeness. Something in his eyes made my skin crawl. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, and I instinctively backed up toward my car. He kept asking me questions. Where I was headed, how far I had to go. I lied about everything. I told him I was meeting my boyfriend in the next town, and he was expecting me any minute. I saw the flicker of disappointment in his eyes when I said that. That's when I knew I needed to get out of there. I mumbled some excuse about needing to go and practically jumped into my car, locking the doors the second I was inside. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I watched him in my rearview mirror. He was still standing there, staring at my car as I drove away. I didn't see his SUV follow me, but I kept my eye on every vehicle behind me for the rest of the drive. To this day, I don't know what that guy wanted.